Hi, everyone. My name is Abigail Madden. I am the Associate Program Officer for Chicago's Artistic Vitality Program for the Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly Foundation. Thank you so much for being here today for our third and final webinar training around accessibility. We've had great interest and feedback that the first two trainings went really well, so we really appreciate you all joining us today on this rainy Thursday here in Chicago. Before we get started, I want to just take care of a few things. First, I'd love to introduce our service providers. Today, we have live captions happening by SignNexus. I'm going to go ahead and drop in our chat the stream text link for those of you that would like to view the captions. You can also enable captions as well. As you were joining, you may have noticed that we are recording this. We will be posting all three of the trainings on our YouTube channel after we're finished. So if you can keep your camera off and stay muted, that would be great. We will hopefully have time for some Q&A at the end, and then we'll encourage you to join us with cameras on and unmute. As I mentioned, my name is Abigail Madden. I am a white woman with shoulder-length red hair. Today, I am wearing a black and gray turtleneck sweater, and I have hoop earrings on. I am coming to you from Chicago. We do have some folks, arts leaders from the Low Country joining us as well. The Donnelly Foundation funds in both the Chicagoland area and the Low Country. And for our Chicago folks who are not familiar with the Low Country, that is a geographic and cultural region along South Carolina's coast that extends from Georgetown through Charleston to Beaufort, almost down to the Georgia border. So I want to welcome our Low Country folks for being here. And because we are coming to you from Chicago, I do want to do a land acknowledgement from Chicago. Chicago is located on the ancestral homelands of the Council of Three Fires, which is the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa. As an important land and water crossroads, many other Native communities lived and traded here and called it home. Chicago was one of the original 5 cities designated in the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. And today, the region is home to the 3rd largest urban Native American population in the US, with members representing numerous tribal communities. So in addition to our live captioning by SignNexus, we have a audio description person here today. Victor Cole is joining us. Victor is going to be just joining us today, and then afterwards we'll be adding audio description. So our recording, you will have the opportunity to hear Victor do those audio descriptions. So thank you, Victor, for being here. We also have Kyle Hammond of KBH Media. Kyle is going to be helping us on the technical side. So if any of you have questions or need technology help, feel free to send me a message in the chat, or you can also reach out to Kyle via chat as well. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd love to introduce our fearless presenter, Christina Gunther. Christina has joined us for our last 2 trainings and is an expert in the field. I'll tell you a little bit about her now. Bringing Chicago together around the intersection of disability and the arts was Christina Gunther's main aim as she started Cultural Access Collaborative in 2013. Having over 15 years of experience in cultural accessibility from a variety of cultural organizations, including the Metropolitan Museum and Lincoln Center, she currently serves as the Assistant Director of Disability Services at Adler University, and she is the founder and president of the Collab. Thanks to her brother, who has Down syndrome, cultural accessibility became her passion as they visited museums and attended plays together. Christina speaks internationally about cultural accessibility, especially the importance of establishing a local access knowledge network in one's own community. In addition to Christina, we will have a special guest joining us today. Christina will introduce Bill Green when we get to him. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to Christina, who's going to tell us about accessibility for guests who are blind or have low vision. Again, thank you all for being here. And Christina, take it away.
Hey everyone, it's so good to be back, and I'm excited for our last session together. I am a white woman in my late 30s. I have dark hair that is about shoulder length, a little bit longer. I'm wearing a striped shirt, and behind me is a curtain that's blocking the rainy Chicago weather that we have right now. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this topic, and I'm really grateful for our guest that we have, who I'll introduce in a bit, who really is an expert in this topic. I feel always a little uncomfortable with the term expert because I know a lot about a bunch of different areas of accessibility, but I don't have that lived experience piece that our guest has. So I'm really grateful to have him here today. So I'm going to be modeling accessibility, as I try to do for all of my sessions that I present, and I encourage you to do as well. So I'm going to be describing everything that I'm sharing on the slides. So right now, the majority of the PowerPoint that I'm sharing is going to be text. The background that I've chosen is one that looks kind of like a gallery to me. So there's a sort of white wall, and then we see at the bottom a wood floor that connects to the white wall. So the title slide is showing right now, Accessibility for Guests Who Are Blind or Have Low Vision, has my name, my pronouns, which are she, her, and my different titles, which are Accessibility Consultant, that's the capacity I'm in today, and I am also the founder and president of the Cultural Access Collaborative. As we've said many times, I do love to get email, and if you have questions, want to be connected to other folks, want to learn more about anything we've talked about today, I'd love to hear from you. My email address is cgunther@culturalaccesscollab.org. So I'm going to start, as I've started the other sessions, just kind of going over some of the basics if this is your first time here. If it's not, hopefully this is all starting to sound really familiar, and maybe you could do this part of the presentation. But Cultural Access Collaborative, it used to be called the Chicago Cultural Accessibility Consortium, or CCAC. We are primarily a volunteer-run nonprofit. We just have one part-time staff member, and that's it. Our mission is to empower Illinois' cultural spaces to become more accessible to visitors with disabilities. And we do this primarily by providing professional development workshops, kind of like this one, free accessible equipment loans, and an access calendar that lists accessible events happening in the region. Please email me to join our listserv if you want to get involved and to learn more about future professional development workshops, or to get connected with the Collab community. I also start every session with including a different photo of my brother, Travis. This is one of my favorite pictures of him. I usually say, and I'm saying it again, he is, I'm contractually obligated as a big sister and as his agent, because he is an artist, to share information about him in the hopes of him becoming really famous. That's what he wants. So Travis has Down syndrome. He's in his mid-30s. He's got a receding hairline, and his arms are extended really wide with a big smile. He's wearing a red jacket that says Travis on it. And behind him, we're visiting a sculpture garden. So you can see sculptures of cows, a huge lily pond, and some other like primary colored type sculptures as well. So Travis is the main reason why I got involved in this work, like Abby mentioned at the top, and really got me inspired to be involved with cultural accessibility. When I first started this work, I did not have a disability, but I've since acquired one. I live with post-concussion syndrome, so I struggle especially with my vision, and I do see double sometimes. So that often means I work in the dark, and I try where I can to not be on camera for Zoom. Today, it makes sense to be on camera. since I'm presenting, but in general, I usually am have my camera off and sitting in the dark and need to take extra breaks. That's basically what it means to me. So what is disability? I think that's a good place to make sure we're all on the same page. First off, we'll share the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA definition. Disability, someone who has a disability is someone who has a record of or is regarded as having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And that could include eating, breathing, walking, talking, and for today, for what we're talking about, seeing, etc. My favorite definition is from the NORA Project, which is an awesome nonprofit here in Chicago. Their definition is a disability is a difference in the way a person moves, communicates, feels, and or processes information. It's a difference in the way they complete the tasks of daily life. And my favorite part, there's nothing good or bad about disability. It's simply a form of human diversity. So we've got to keep this in mind as we're going through this presentation today, that this isn't anything to feel like as blindness rather isn't anything we need to feel sorry for or regret or anything like that. It's just simply a difference, and blindness has existed as long as humans have existed. So it is just a fact. And so that's why we as cultural administrators need to be prepared to welcome guests who are blind or have low vision. Next slide is the important reminder: disability is a normal part of the human experience. So again, we've got to be prepared for this. We don't need to be surprised by this when guests arrive and are not able to see. So as cultural administrators, it's really important that we step outside of the medical model of disability. So right now I'm sharing an image. On the left, it says medical model, and there's a circle. It says the issue is the individual with arrows pointing inward. So in the medical model, which is still, you'll definitely find in hospitals and a lot of times in media, the medical model is really putting the onus on the individual who has a disability to get better, to find a way to cope, to find a cure, to learn to walk again, to be able to have surgery to see again. That we want to fix them to become, as normal. I'm using air quotes there. And, it's on them to find adaptations. It's not anyone else's responsibility. Instead, we need to be adapting to the social model, which is there's a circle and it says the issue is an inaccessible world, and there's arrows pointing out. So it's on all of us and the power structures, the influence that we have to be considering people with a variety of disabilities, because we know disability is a fact of life. We need to be making changes to the ways that we provide our services so that everybody is able to access them. And the example I often provide is the idea of a museum sitting on top of a huge stairway that leads up to it. That is a design choice that was made by, the architects, that was made by the administration of the museum. All of these different people in power made the choice to add stairs, and stairs can create a barrier for people. And so instead, if we remove the stairs, we make it possible for everyone to come to our spaces. So we're not blaming the person for not being able to come up the stairs, for instance, in this example. Instead, we're going to change the way that they're going to get into our space. So that's the way we need to also be shifting the paradigm in our minds for how we're thinking about welcoming guests with disabilities. So some fast facts, reminders about disability that I think are especially important for us to take to our leadership, to remind them why this work is so important and why we need to be doing this at the front end rather than adapting later when issues arise. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans has some type of disability. And this percentage is expected to grow as we age and as we live longer. I think all of us know in ourselves or in our loved ones, we have seen them perhaps acquire disabilities as they're getting older, perhaps difficulty walking, hearing, seeing, etc. That's accepted as something that happens as we age. And we've got to take that into consideration, especially in a lot of our cultural spaces where our membership base or our board member base or, the primary audience we're serving often are older people that therefore are more likely to have a disability. and probably less likely to identify as having a disability. African Americans are more likely than non-Hispanic whites to have a disability in every single age group. So if I think all of our institutions have been, rightfully so, putting an emphasis on trying to be anti-racist institutions, that also means that we need to be considering disability and be considering the ways that guests with all different types of differences likely have a disability too. And so we want to make sure that we're being considerate of that as we try to be anti-racist. We also need to make sure that we're being considerate of disabilities. Anyone may join the disability community at any time, temporarily or permanently. So in my example, for me, I became disabled by some fluke that something fell on my head. And so therefore now I am a part of the disability community. And in fact, it took me about a year to realize that I was a part of the disability community. But that's something that may change for me, or it may be permanent. And so I think for all of us, if you don't live with a disability right now, keep in mind that it's likely you will, whether it's you have foot surgery or knee surgery or something temporarily, or it's something permanent that happens, like what happened to me, for instance. Many disabilities are invisible. And so just by looking at someone, by kind of assessing in a group, we're not going to know necessarily if somebody has a disability or not. And in the case today of talking about people who are blind or have low vision, if they don't have some sort of visible cane or service dog, or, really thick glasses, we might not be able to tell that they are blind or have low vision unless they identify, unless they're reaching out and letting us know. And so we need to take that into consideration as well, that we should expect it rather than be looking for some visible marker that we're going to find in our audience. And especially through aging, but in any case, people may have multiple disabilities. And so, we tried to break up disability into some more manageable categories for you, because this is a huge topic. And so today, we're focusing specifically on people who are blind or have low vision, but certainly there could be people who are blind who have physical disabilities, or someone who's deafblind, or somebody who's blind and has some sort of cognitive disability. The possibilities and combinations are endless. And so taking that into consideration as well is really important. And then all disabilities exist on a spectrum. So, we might think of a blind person, for instance, as somebody that cannot see anything at all. And that might not be the case. They might have some vision, or on some days they might see better than others. And so taking into consideration, people might need different things on different days, or might, just because this accommodation worked for one person doesn't mean it's going to work for another. And then this is another reminder on the slide, which is if you've met a person with a disability, that's great, but you've met one person with a disability. So that's why we need to really be offering choices, because people may need different things. What is ableism? This is also important, I think, especially as we're talking about so many different isms in our organizations and trying to dismantle them and be aware of oppression in all of its different forms. And so ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. This is a quote from Talila Lewis and Dustin Gibson. So I really encourage you to take to heart today, be thinking about what values and ideas about what's normal do you hold that you may be unconsciously perpetuating ableist attitudes. And I think especially when we're talking about vision and talking about visuals, especially in a lot of our arts organizations, a lot of that is visual. Be thinking about how our audiences who can't see might be experiencing and might still be able to appreciate and enjoy the art that we're presenting. So realizing as well that many of you here on the call, I'm guessing, have a disability, and that we're very likely in whatever we're performing or providing for our audiences, we're very likely to encounter disabled people at every event, at every performance, at every tour, each day. And so while we might have some specialized programs, or we might be offering some scheduled events that might be for people that particularly self-identify, at the same time, we should be prepared for and planning for having disabled people at everything we're providing. really make that and bake that into whatever we're doing. So now let's specifically get into accessibility for audiences who are blind or have low vision. And I want to now invite Bill Green to come on screen. We're so fortunate to have Bill here today. I've known Bill for a long time. And Bill, we'll let you introduce yourself because you have a lot of really interesting pieces that you bring to the table today.
Hi, thank you, Christina. Thanks for the introduction. Hi, my name is Bill Green. I'm a middle-aged white man with dark hair and beard. I'm wearing glasses and a blue shirt. I'm sitting in my home's basement this morning. I have, well, I'll just start with your first question here, Christina, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I would say I identify as low vision. And that I have been since birth, so my entire life. I grew up going to lots of cultural institutions. I grew up in a city that had a museum, and when we would go on vacations, we would go to lots of museums, zoos, aquariums, and really enjoyed that, and didn't know that even that doing accessibility in those places ever exists. I've been working in accessibility for about 9 years now, but I feel like that I've probably been creating accessibility for myself in these venues for many years beyond that, for my entire life. So are you okay with just like running through these, Christina, there, or did you want to actually ask me these?
However you want to do it is totally
Right.
fine. So
Well, I'm going to go ahead and start on to this next
Go for
question
it.
because it's about, so on the screen here, are you comfortable sharing more about your disability and how it impacts you when visiting cultural spaces? So like I said, I would identify as low vision, meaning that I do have vision. I've since in my life had to change to wearing glasses, and there has been some changes, but I've always had low vision. And so when you go into a museum, there's no reading the signs. There's no being able to see the signs that are in cases, signs that are up so many places. There's definitely problems with wayfinding. When you ask staff, where is something? They're like, well, you go past this, like, the icons you gave me or the things to look for, I will never see those. I don't know. This entire building is white with wood floors, and every room looks the same to me. So I would say one of the biggest hurdles that comes up is wayfinding and reading things. And you just go into a cultural institution with the expectation that you are going to miss out on something. That is just the baseline that you are starting from. Because I'll get to this a little bit more with some advice to institutions. But I think that's an important thing to think about, is that they're not just myself, but having worked with lots of people who are blind and low vision, there is just the expectation that if I go to an institution, I'm going to miss out on things. And there's a lot of people who think that because they have low vision, because they've lost vision as life has gone on, that cultural institutions, that part of their life has gone past them, and that there's nothing there for them. And I'm a strong believer that there is a lot of things, and I have just had tremendously rewarding experiences in being able to be with people when those experiences are created. And then on the other side of that, be able to create those experiences for people. I think we all know that cultural institutions have a tremendous ability to just create great feelings, to educate, to really create meaningful experiences for people. And I'm a strong believer that that can be done in a lot of different ways with folks who are blind and low vision. But I'm getting ahead of myself. And then talking about the next question on this is, what advice, prep work do you need to do before attending a cultural event? this is a tough one because there's not a lot of pre-thought that goes into providing resources for people who are blind and low vision in advance. Definitely with theaters, you can look up audio description. And when I say theaters, both live theater and like movie theaters, looking up audio description on things is a great thing. Having those icons, having that information readily available. Not everybody, you have to dig sometimes to find that information. And like being able to actually confirm, because sometimes that information's there and then you show up and then like, well, we were actually wrong about that. And then I've also found with wayfinding, social narratives end up being a great way to do wayfinding. The primary audience for a social narrative is people with neurodiversity, but it makes for a really great way to look at. I was a few months ago, it was at John Ball Zoo in Michigan, and I went on I looked at their social narrative because I was just curious what the zoo was and what was there. It ended up being great. I really enjoyed having a little bit of that background before visiting. And the next questions are, you're doing a great job asking questions, Christina. What are some accessibility misses?
I'm laughing along, yes. You're a great interviewer and interviewee, Bill.
I didn't mean to take this over. You could ask the next question.
It's totally fine. I really don't care.
Right. What are some of the accessibility misses you've experienced at cultural events? How did those misses impact you and your guests? And I used to work for a nonprofit that supported people who are blind and low vision. And we had a movie club. It was a really fun movie club. And we would go to theaters and see audio described movies. And a consistent thing was audio description material equipment did not work always, or staff were not aware of audio description. Like they would hand you equipment that was actually for closed captioning or something like that. And I think that is something that a lot of people think that, well, once you have maybe like to create accessibility, you need technology in place. Well, the more important thing is you need technology in place that people are trained on and that technology can be reliably used. The frustration of having something that's supposed to be accessible and it doesn't work in the moment is far more damaging, far more like feels like a barrier than not having something there at all. So I think that's an important thing I would say, is like when you have those processes in place, whether it is a technology or something else, make sure people are trained on it and they know how it works. The next question is this: what are some accessible wins you've experienced, especially at smaller venues? How did those wins impact you and your guests? Well, I went right before the pandemic. I went to see a play, to see Oedipus, and I just happened to show up. I did not know this. It was a day that there was audio description, and I knew the person doing the audio description too, which was great. And so I just took a headset, and it was I've never I don't go to a ton of theater, but I've never gone to one where it was like just happened to be the audio description performance, and it was kind of amazing to see that in place and to have that already there. I want to talk a little more about that. I think also I've done a lot of work with, in the past, what is now called the Institute. I wrote this down over here. Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures at the University of Chicago. And one of the reasons I bring this up is this was formerly called the Oriental Institute. Is we worked for years, myself and I would bring folks there to create a program for people who are blind and low vision that included a lot of tactile information, a lot of storytelling information. They brought in a lot of their PhD candidates in archaeology to talk, museum staff, museum volunteers led things. We did a lot of training with staff. It ended up being this really great, robust thing that for a while I was taking groups every 2-3 months. We were going and doing a new program, not repeating the same program, but doing a new program there. And it just became such a like a go-to. People, the word got out and people were interested. More people started coming. And I loved that. And nothing they did was expensive. Nothing they did was costing a lot of money. It was having people who knew material, who had some tactile things this year, but who also just wanted to take the time to tell stories and connect with guests. And it was great. I'm sure there are some other wins, but I wanted to get to this last question. Any tips you would like to share with cultural administrators of smaller organizations about making their spaces more accessible? Like so many things we could do. Christina, we could do a whole nother series on just this question of people. If people want to do several more hours of trainings, we could talk a lot about this. But I made some notes here for some key things that I always want to tell people is that I work at a cultural institution. I've consulted with, I think now over 30 cultural institutions. And with all of them, I say the same thing, is that accessibility does not have to be expensive. If you or your institution or someone is saying, well, we can't afford to have accessibility, it's not, you don't have to have this be expensive. There's so many things that can be done for a low cost. I think a great example is going back to what we did with the Oriental Institute. There was already such an archive, such a rich collection in their office of tactile things, pottery that was 5,000 years old. It was like, this is sitting here in somebody's office. We could, of course, just have guests have the experience of handling and touching these things. Identifying things like that, finding people on staff who are interested in talking with folks, doing where I call it like a sighted description tour, where I'll just walk around with folks, and especially people who are low vision and blind, really focusing on describing things, giving descriptions of things, but also telling stories. Just so much of telling stories. I had a great example where I took a group of people. We went to a little museum, to the Smart Museum, which is also at University of Chicago campus, and there was a Rodin exhibit there. It was amazing. You know, we got to be right up close with these Rodin sculptures. Amazing. And they also showed us a few things from their permanent collection. And one was a series of illustrations that were from a magazine article about a fire in a tenement building that ended up being, like in the early 20th century, that ended up being kind of a landmark legal case for tenants' rights. And they had the original illustrations from this. It's an interesting thing to have. But the whole thing about these, it was maybe like 20 illustrations, is the story that these illustrations told, all the story tied to that. More of the folks who I was with afterwards, they talked more about that narrative, that really interesting story related to these illustrations. And they talked about being, you know, right up close, hands-on with Rodin sculptures. So just storytelling doesn't cost a lot. It can be a tremendously meaningful experience for folks who are blind and low vision, emphasizing that. And that brings to is like, always have a person in place. Time and time again, I've worked with groups of people, with organizations who are like, we're going to replace a person who would sell tickets with a kiosk that sells tickets. And the first thing is, people who are blind, low vision, like, having that person there was what made it accessible to us. So many times, people who are blind and low vision, it is so helpful to have a person in place, whether that is that planning of the trip to the organization, being there, or even afterwards, the follow-up afterward. But having a person in place who can provide some assistance is always going to trump having a device, like something on their phone, some other resource in place, something that's again like a kiosk or something. Having a person can be the best piece of accessibility. Never privilege the sighted experience. I think Christina already touched on this a little bit about not feeling sorry for or thinking less of someone who is disabled. So many cultural institutions have sight is such a kind of the hierarchy of the senses. Sight is at the top, and I would say never privilege the sight experience. No one Don't feel like that a person who is blind or low vision is going to have a lesser or non-meaningful experience, or the experience that they have is in some way lesser. And what they're taking away is a lower or a not a meaningful experience. Um, uh, I would also say the hire people with disabilities to provide access. I was 19 years old before I ever met someone another person who was low vision and was fully employed. There is very low levels of employment among people who are blind and low vision. That's pretty amazing. You never see yourself represented through that many years of life in something as basic as full-time employment. And you will do your organization will be making a connection with folks on a different level if they are coming as guests who identify as disabled and they are interacting with staff who are also identifying as disabled. Integrate your accessibility. Don't make your accessibility something that is a burden that staff has to like wheel out, has to be requested ahead of time. I'm a big fan of integrating accessibility so that's in place. We wouldn't have a guest who's using a wheelchair call us 2 weeks in advance to set up a ramp for when they come to the venue. You know, we're required to put ramps in place. Think about your other accessibility offerings and how those can be integrated and offered to people. I mentioned at the beginning that when you go to a venue, before you ever enter, you know you are going to miss out. You know that you are going to be missing out on something. I am a huge proponent, and when I'm at work and I'm working with other places, about thinking about accessibility as someone who comes to your venue and identifies as disabled, when they first enter, to have that feeling of they had been thought about, that the place had, before they had entered, before someone with disability had ever entered, they had clearly been thought about. The venue has the idea of, we knew you were coming, and we've thought about what accessibility to put in place and what type of things are going to make this a supportive, beneficial, and full experience for you. No one, so often we don't have that. Someone who comes with a disability does not feel welcome. It's a reason a lot of people with disabilities may stay away from cultural institutions, is because they don't have that sense of welcome. And that's a tremendous thing is thinking about that ahead of time. And finally, I just want to say, listen to your community. If you're not doing collecting feedback, doing focus groups for people with disabilities to give feedback to your institution, do that. Do your own. Don't latch onto somebody else's. Do your own and ask people specifically about your venue, and work with people to collect everything. I'm a big fan of just, like, you can make it a specific thing. I did a focus group about talking with folks about interpretive message on signage. And in those focus groups, I also got so much information about bathrooms, for example. That was great. I loved it. I was so happy that people just wanted to go on tangents and tell me all kinds of other things. And all of that information informs and integrates things that I do with work. And I'm constantly have folks from those meetings that I can check in with and follow up on. It's great to open, to show that you're very open to listen to folks and always keep those channels open. So maybe it went past my time, Christina, but I wanted to get lots of things in.
Phil, it was so great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I mean, you hit on all the key points. And I totally would attend the all-day session you would lead where you could go into greater detail. But I think, some things that really stood out to me was like that idea of belonging that you're talking about, that we really need to be, like I was saying at the beginning, we need to be expecting that disabled guests are going to be coming to our spaces, and rather than be surprised by it. And so that really comes across in so many different ways to people when you have not been considered. And so really providing those channels. I think another piece that stood out to me was what you talked about, like the advanced prep work that you're doing of kind of digging around a website, which is annoying for anyone, but I think especially for our blind or low vision guests can be especially annoying to try to dig around on a website. So I think having accessibility information front and center is important for all audiences, but especially for this one. And I would say, if you're listing for different audience groups, kind of different access services, always putting the information for blind or low vision guests at the top is really helpful too, to make it, again, easier to find stuff. And I think the final thing that really stood out to me is that staff training piece, right? Like, especially when we're talking about this audience, there's so much awesome technology out there that can make things more accessible for people. And it also can make things way more inaccessible. So having a person who knows what the heck is going on, can help troubleshoot, can help be there if someone needs help, is vital for every audience again, but I think especially for this one. So those were some really powerful points for me. Would you be comfortable, Bill, sharing your contact information with folks? I'm putting you on the spot, so you can say no.
Sure, I can give them. So I'm have the great privilege of being a steering committee member on the Cultural Access Collaborative with Christina, and so I'd be happy to give out that email. It's B Green. I can drop it in the chat. Actually, that might be easiest. But it's B Green at Cultural Access Collab.
.org. Yeah,
Yes.
Totally. Thank you so much, Bill, for doing that and for all that you do. Like I said, Bill, I think wears so many different hats, and we're really lucky to have you here today. So thank you. So I'm going to keep going in the interest of time, but I could really keep talking to you for a lot longer. So thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for
the
chance to talk today, too. Appreciate it.
So we are going to now keep diving into our topic, but I hope that Bill helped really, I think, be kind of our compass to help us show like what we want our cultural spaces to be and how welcoming we want to be. I just realized the other thing I meant to say was, I think what Bill said about the hierarchy of senses is really true. Sometimes I've heard it even called the tyranny of sight, that we really are saying, putting sight over everything. And I think especially for our spaces that are really focused on the visual arts, this can be the case. But, the senses, just seeing something is only part of it, only part of the experience. And so there's meaning to be found in those stories that we can share, like Bill was sharing. So I think really getting out of the idea that there's just kind of this binary of like, you have to see it to experience it. That's not the case. There are different ways to experience what we're presenting. So anyway, back to blindness. So the definition of blindness, which is helpful for us as we go forward. So blindness is the inability to see either partially or totally. It is diagnosed when a person's best corrected eyesight, so the highest visual acuity they can reach using glasses, medication, or surgery, falls below a certain threshold. A person's visual field, which is the area that can be seen when their eyes are fixed on a specific point, is significantly smaller than normal. And I don't like the term normal, but smaller than average. Blindness continued. So people may self-identify using a variety of different terms, like blind, legally blind, visually impaired, partially sighted, low vision. And I think like we were talking about, older adults might not identify as being blind or low vision, but they still might be experiencing it. However, people choose to identify, like any disability type, totally fine and up to them. And all of these terms that I've shared here are totally fine to use in your communication. I typically say blind or have low vision, but you can also consult with your community to see what you think is kind of the most common terms in your area too. Something that I think is hard for those of us who are sighted to understand is that blindness exists on a spectrum, which may vary day by day even. I think there's this misconception that most blind people just see darkness when there could be a different experience that every person has. Maybe they see some light, maybe they are able to see, they have peripheral vision and can't focus on the center, maybe the opposite. All of that really varies. And so, don't be surprised if, you think someone's totally blind, but they're like, oh, I see that detail right there. They still may be able to, and they still may be blind or have low vision. It's very rarely absolute. We're often, as sighted people, when we're talking about blind guests, thinking about some sort of visual indicator, because many people who are blind may use a cane, have a dog, have dark sunglasses if they have photophobia, the sensitivity to light. They very rarely are using assistive technology or a companion, but also keep in mind there may be no assistance at all and be able to tell it all. So there are, again, a variety of ways that people might go about the world and still be able to be independent. Here's some information about how many blind people there are in the world and a little bit more about fast facts related to blindness and vision loss. So 8% of Americans, or 20 million Americans, are blind or have low vision. And what I think is really significant is that number jumps up to 18% for adults who are 65 and up in America. So again, blindness and low vision we can expect, especially as we age. So again, thinking about our audience, if we're talking primarily about expecting an older audience to an event that we're having, very likely there are going to be multiple people who are blind or have low vision in that audience. Like Bill mentioned, unemployment is a big issue for all people with disabilities, but especially for people who are blind or have low vision. Less than half of adults with visual impairments are employed. And so that's wherever, we're consulting with the community, also be thinking about compensation. We want to make sure we're compensating people for their perspectives and their lived experience, even if we're a small institution. Depression is associated with vision loss. And I wanted to share that fact with you all. And I think it's significant to point out that I think a lot of that depression is not just because somebody is blind, but rather it's because of all of the barriers that society puts in place for them that makes it very difficult for somebody to live independently and go about their life. And so that's what makes it even more important for our cultural institutions to really be a beacon, to really be welcoming people who are blind or have low vision to our spaces because of that mental health component as well. And also social loss may accompany vision loss. So especially as we're thinking about older adults losing their vision, that might also mean a loss of a lot of social activities that they have been a part of. Like Bill mentioned, and like I've also experienced when I worked at the Metropolitan Museum, a lot of people would think that, as they got older and lost their vision, they could no longer come to the museum, for instance. And there actually were a lot of different opportunities for them to come if they knew about it. But I think realizing that there is a lot of sadness that can happen, and it's not just because somebody is losing their vision, it's because of these barriers that are put in place. And so that's where we need to do our part to remove them wherever we can. I've always heard that fewer than 10% of blind people can read Braille. I did some research on it for this presentation, and turns out that statistic may be inaccurate, but there isn't an accurate statistic of exactly how many Braille users there are out there. And that's partly because it's like, what does it mean to read Braille? That definition can vary. But I think the takeaway here is there's sometimes an assumption that everyone who's blind knows how to read Braille, and that is not the case. And that is definitely more of a minority of people who are blind actually can use Braille. And so that's where we again need to be consulting with the individual or be offering choices for people about how to access printed material. Maybe they read Braille, maybe they don't. A lot of that has to do if you're congenitally blind, if you're born blind, versus you acquire blindness later in life. So for instance, for those older adults, chances are good they're not going to be Braille readers. But if we're welcoming, for instance, a school group of kids from a school that serves people who are blind or low vision, probably a lot of them are going to be reading Braille. So that really depends. And then in 2017, 7 million Americans are estimated to use screen readers, according to WebAIM. And I'm sure that number is even higher now. I couldn't find more recent statistic. We'll talk more about what screen readers are, but that has to do with our digital access piece. And that's going to be really important when we're talking about this audience. We talked a little bit about service animals, and I think the idea of quote unquote a seeing eye dog really comes into play here. Service animals might be used by people with a variety of different disabilities, but especially when we're talking about this audience, service animals come into the conversation. There's usually a lot of questions about service animals, and there honestly are lots of webinars that are specifically about service animals, so I don't want to go into too much detail for you all today. And I won't take too many questions about service animals because that can sometimes derail conversations a little bit because it is a little complicated. But I am sharing a link at the end from the ada.gov website that has a fact sheet that's going to really help you understand a lot about service animals. So that will be shared and you all will get this presentation afterwards as well. But some highlights about service animals. So first of all, service animal is defined as a dog that has been trained, it has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. And I highlighted dog and trained. Those are really two key points. Since it's going to be a dog and they're going to have been trained to do work. Service animals are permitted in most public spaces, even if other animals are not permitted. So unless there would be a really strong reason, like there are, for instance, at zoos, some different guidelines that are put into place related to service animals because of the safety of the other animals and for the service dog. But generally speaking, in most of our cultural spaces, service animals are going to be welcome. So even if you have a policy, no dogs here, you would need to make an exception. The tasks that are performed by the dog must be directly related to the person's disability. So for instance, if we're talking about someone who's blind or have low vision, the dog would have been trained to specifically work with that individual and help them wayfinding and help them, to protect them in case of emergency, that type of thing. So they would have been trained specifically to be a seeing eye dog for that person, for instance. There is no documentation or signage that's needed for service animals, and you cannot ask for it. So there is no licensing of that. And if you see information about that, that's just somebody trying to make a buck. Oftentimes, though, people that do have service dogs do usually get a harness that says service dog just to try to avoid people petting it or distracting the dog. And then finally, 2 questions that you can ask. You can't ask a lot of questions when it comes to service dogs if someone says that they have a service dog, but you can ask, is the dog or service animal required because of a disability? And you can also ask, what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? So that's a little info about service animals. So let's dive into specifically thinking about cultural spaces for people who are blind or have low vision. And I'm sharing different images of the different symbols related to blindness and low vision. So first symbol I'm sharing is a person that is walking and using a cane. So that is a symbol for access for people who are blind or have low vision. I'm sharing an image that's about audio description. So it says AD, and it looks like a kind of a TV with a frame with 3 sort of parentheses emanating from it, indicating sound. We'll talk about what that is in a second. There's Braille, which is 6 dots that are shared, and it says the word Braille. And then there's large print. So it's just a box that says the word large print. So effective communication, we talked about this for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, and effective communication is a key part of the ADA, of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's really relevant here as well when we're talking about this audience. So cultural organizations must make it possible for individuals with speech, hearing, and vision disabilities to understand what is conveyed and can communicate effectively. The goal is to ensure that communication with people with disabilities is as effective as communication with people without disabilities. And then this point at the end is really important. We must provide auxiliary aids or services in the individual's normal methods of receiving communication when providing services. And so this is a great example of Braille versus other alternate formats. So if somebody doesn't read Braille and they're blind, giving them Braille is not going to be effective communication. So we need to make sure that we're providing it in the method that the person needs. So it's pretty basic when you drill down to it, but it's really having a conversation. If someone's asking for access to something, finding out what they need and providing it for them in the method that they need. So alternate formats is really, really important for us to understand. And when we're thinking about printed material in all of our cultural spaces, chances are good there's a lot of printed material. So Bill talked about museums, thinking about our labels and signage. There's usually lots of that in those spaces. And then thinking about theaters and performance spaces, usually we have a playbill or we have a program or something that's printed. So those are often some of the key ways we're communicating with our guests. So we need to be considering the different ways guests interact with printed material, and we need to provide options where possible. And if, for some reason you don't have options available, you can make it easy for people to ask for it and ask what format works best for that individual. So an example here would be in a museum context, having those labels in large print or having Braille labels available is really helpful. The way that some institutions do it is they just, as a matter of course, have all of their label copy in large print, which is type 6 or 18 or higher. Or you could, for instance, at the Met, when I worked at the Met Museum, we created large print labels in a booklet that was available at the front of the exhibition. It was in order of the way that people would experience the exhibit, for instance, and it would be the label copy of each of the works of art that were included in order, and it would be available in large print. So if, for whatever reason you don't have the space or the ability, or it's a big fight with the designers to have something in large print, you can have another method for people to access it that way. Could be having a QR code that would be super obvious where people could listen to it. It could be, a stop on your audio guide tour, different things like that. It also could be that you're providing things in Braille as well. So maybe you're having something both in large print, and then you're also having those Braille labels in a booklet, for instance, that people can carry around and go from piece to piece with. We want to make sure that we're following contrast, font, and size guidelines. There's a lot of information about this online. I'm sharing this in resources too, but there's a lot of guidance about how to make that more accessible for people. So make sure that you're following that. And we need to be providing the playbill or program or materials in alternate formats, which would include large print, Braille, digital format, audio format. So there could be lots of different ways people are accessing it. I've also seen institutions, for instance, provide the program copy on their website in advance, and people can download it and get the digital format that way. I've seen people in the old days, people used to record the playbill, for instance, on a cassette and give it to people. Obviously, nobody uses cassettes anymore, but you could do a version of that using a voice memo, for instance, and sending it to guests that way, having it available that way, providing it in Braille. Lots of different options are important for this audience. I wanted to share, because each time we've done this, I've shared sort of an access fail. So I'm sharing hashtag access fail. This is from The Independent, the UK newspaper, and it's a screen grab of a headline from the lifestyle section that says, "Blind man documents experience getting stuck in an inaccessible hotel." And the next part of the headline is, "I don't feel disabled when I fiddle around for stuff, but when things are inaccessible, I'm forced to live in my own disability," singer Mario Bond says. And this is just from April of this year. So this is an example of wayfinding. This man got into the elevator, and it turned out none of the buttons had Braille or anything that was raised at all. So he could not figure out how to get off of the elevator and got stuck what ended up being for a really long time before somebody was able to help him. And so this is an example of, we need to be providing things in alternate formats for people. New elevators now, you're probably familiar if you've been to a hotel or, my high rise where I work, we have both the buttons that are in Braille on our elevator, and we also have audio that comes on that says what floor people are on. So those are some of the ways that we're providing alternate formats. And so I encourage you, as you go about your business, if you are sighted, to be thinking about those ways that things are provided in alternate formats for people. And in our spaces, we need to be doing that as well. So that could be that we have a volunteer stationed in the elevator because our elevator is really old and doesn't have anything. That could be that we're going to add Braille and some raised letters to make it easier for people to figure out how to get to the ground floor, how to get to the different floors. That could mean lots of different things for you, but I encourage you to think creatively about how to address that. So screen reader access is really important. We want to ensure all digital copy is accessible for people who use screen readers. And so some easy tips for eBlasts, websites, and other digital materials are to add alt text for images shared. And that would include for social media. So we'll talk a little bit more about what alt text is in a minute, but that's really important. So thinking about all the different ways we communicate with our guests in our, in an online format. And a lot of times that includes visuals. We want to make sure those visuals are accessible. If you have graphics that include text, make sure the text is elsewhere. So for instance, if you have a big performance, a big exhibit, and you're going to have a graphic designer design some sort of beautiful logo for that event, make sure that the title also just exists separately. So it could be, Christina Gunther, and you've made a beautiful logo with my name in it. Then I would also just put Christina Gunther under that as well. So it's very clear for someone who uses a screen reader to be able to access it. We want to make sure we're using check accessibility features. So if you're generating content, there are lots of ways, for instance, in Word or in Adobe, for you to check the accessibility to make sure it truly is accessible for people. In our different collateral material online, we want to use descriptive links. So that means we are hyperlinking words that make sense of what people are clicking on. So it could be, the example I'm sharing here is buy tickets for this show, and all of that is hyperlinked, versus the click here option, which is not really obvious for people what they're clicking on. So we want to make it really obvious for screen readers, because oftentimes links are shared in a different way for people that use screen readers. So if you took that link away from the context of the other text, is it obvious where you're going to go, what website or what information you're going to get? And it just makes it look a lot cleaner too. Click here doesn't look very good when you see that over and over again, just in general. Also want to be using camel case on links and hashtags. So for instance, I'm sharing the hashtag just do it. And if it was hashtag just do it with everything lowercase, a screen reader would read it as one weird sounding word. If you capitalize the J, the D, and the I, then it would read it as just do it. So that's really helpful. And it's just, I think, as somebody that can see pretty well, it just looks nicer and it's more obvious to me as well. So that's called camel case, where you're capitalizing the first letter of each of the words that are in a link or in an email address, for instance. Web accessibility. This is another piece that's really important for this audience. And I really encourage you to not make the assumption that, just because you have a new website, that your designers that design it know what they're doing and know how to make it accessible. That's a big mistake that I see happen a lot. You really want to make sure, if you are creating a new website, that the contract states that they are going to be following the WCAG 2.1 standards. So I'm linking to that. So those are universally accepted guidelines for how to make websites accessible. So that should be really the standard of what you're working towards. This is both a legal obligation we have, as well as just why wouldn't we want to make our website, because we usually have so much information on our website, accessible to everyone. So really make sure that if you're making any changes to your website, that you're including accessibility into that piece. There are 2 free ways that you can test web accessibility. So there's Wave and HTML code sniffer. Again, we'll be sharing those links with you all, so you can plug in an email or a URL and you can see how accessible it is. And usually there's some things that you can fix. So you could take a look and you could send that to your designers to try to correct some of it. It's really important that we do our best to make sure that our websites are accessible, since oftentimes people are going to be going on the web in advance to plan their visit. So I did share some videos here. We don't have a lot of time, and so I will include these links as well in what I'm sharing. But it's great to be able to see a screen reader in action so you understand what it's like. But JAWS is the most common screen reader that people use who are blind or low vision. And so that will be reading everything out loud. This example that I'm sharing is also showing if you share, some sort of long URL like http://www. That whole long thing, that is going to be read verbatim, and it sounds really boring and isn't very descriptive. So that's where having those descriptive links is really, really important. It also is showing an example of a lot of the visual choices you might make by using color, bold, highlighting. That won't be read either. And so we want to make sure, we can definitely still use those features to make it more obvious for sighted people, but we shouldn't be relying exclusively on that for communicating with people. We need to make sure that we're providing it in the text in some other way. And I'm going to try to keep going. Okay, so alt text, this is really important too. So alt text or alternative text. I'm sharing an example of how to do this literally in PowerPoint. I just took the screen grab myself, but basically if you right click on an image, you will have the option to add alt text into anything in Word or Microsoft products. So it's really, really easy for you to generate that yourself. And you should be doing that really for anything that you're creating. So you can right click and then it will let you add the alt text. Please avoid pressing there's a button that's generate alt text for me. That's an AI version of like trying to provide alt text. It's never going to be very accurate. It's probably going to be really generic and not that helpful to anybody. So you're going to want to provide your own alt text. So in just a couple of sentences or as concisely as possible, you're going to want to describe what the image is sharing. So in this PowerPoint, it's the image that I'm sharing, it's a PowerPoint. It's very meta. PowerPoint, and I'm sharing the check accessibility feature in PowerPoint. So I took a screen grab of that I'm sharing in PowerPoint. I right clicked on the image I shared, and then I'm providing the alt text for it, which says it's a screen grab of PowerPoint menu options. An arrow points to check accessibility under review, the review tab. So that's the most important information that's being shared in this image. There's other pieces and other info that's on there, but the reason why I'm sharing it is I want to show you where the check accessibility option is. And so that's what I communicated in the alt text. So keep the focus really on why you are including the image. Don't get too bogged down by providing every single word of every single thing, because that's just not going to be helpful for people. Accessible PDF. So if you're creating a PDF, it's really, really important that you're making it accessible so that way a screen reader could read it out loud. So PDFs that were image files are likely not accessible. So if you're making, for instance, like a photocopy from a book, that is not accessible. That's not going to be able to be read very well by a screen reader. If you're generating your own content, you should be using the Save as Adobe PDF option because that is going to be accessible to screen readers. So I'm sharing right now a screen grab of that in the PowerPoint that I made today. And it is one of the options under Home, Save as Adobe PDF, and I have an arrow pointing to it. So you really want to be doing that wherever you're generating content. The easiest way for you to check yourself if you have inherited a PDF or some sort of file that you're sharing with people is to test if it's accessible. You can simply do that by selecting or highlighting the text using a mouse and see if just the text is highlighted or see if it kind of is highlighting weird random things. You're going to know that it is not accessible. So the way that's much clearer that I explained this was if the entire page gets selected or only parts of the text, such as a few words or sentences cannot be selected, then it is an image file, then it is not accessible. It's also really helpful if you just want to bypass the accessible PDF piece. If you're creating something in Word, you could just send it to people in Word who are blind or have low vision, because that way they could edit it how they need to see it. But sometimes if we're, for instance, if it's a form or it's something that we don't want people to be able to edit and we're sending it as a PDF, then we want to make sure that it's accessible. So I'm sharing an example right here of an inaccessible PDF and an accessible PDF. So on the left, the inaccessible PDF is pretty clearly a photocopy of a book. And I can see kind of the pages on the left. And then I tried to highlight and select a sentence to highlight, and it just selected a random rectangle on the screen. It did not select anything that resembles text. So I put a red circle with a line through it showing like that is not accessible. On the right is an accessible PDF, and I can see that because I tried to highlight a sentence and it correctly highlighted the sentence that I wanted to highlight. It's very obviously highlighting the text. So that is a quick way to check to see if a PDF is accessible. So for visual access for meetings and talks like this one today, I'd encourage you to request all speakers share their personal visual descriptions when they introduce themselves and their pronouns. People might not want to do that, and if they don't want to, that's totally fine. Just like if someone doesn't want to share their pronouns, that's totally fine. But it is really accessible if you can briefly describe who you are and, you know, your identity that you're bringing to the table, because blind people might be missing out on that otherwise. For instance, if we had a panel, let's say, and it's all about anti-racism and all of the speakers were white people, that would be really helpful probably for the attendee to know, like, wow, there isn't a person of color that's speaking today. You know, that is helpful information. So if everyone was doing a visual description, the attendee would be like, oh, okay, interesting. So, you know, I think it's really important wherever you can to be able to do that. You want to be describing, like I did today, all visual information presented. So, you know, if you have a photo, like the photo I shared of my brother, briefly describe it, especially the key reason why you're including it. If you're sharing a graph or a chart, summarize the information that is presented. Avoid saying stuff like, you know, read along, or like, I don't want to read this for you. Here it is on the screen. That is really inaccessible for a lot of different people. One, for people who are blind or low vision, but also thinking about people with dyslexia, people who are English language learners, people that just don't read as fast as other people might, people joining a Zoom call by phone and not on their computers, for instance, and just might be listening to the audio. For all of those different reasons, it's really important that you are describing it. It also can make it, you know, more obvious, like, why am I including this chart or graph? It's because it's showing X, Y, or Z and explaining it. When different people are talking, you want to make sure that you're saying your name first. So if we had 5 different people in a meeting, might say, you know, Christina here, I agree with that point, and then turning it over to the next person. And that way it makes it a lot easier for that person to follow along on the call and know who's saying what, because there's a lot of information flying around usually, and you don't on top of that want to try to guess who's saying what and try to remember what their voice sounds like. For presentations and conferences, you really want to request that all speakers are balancing the need to verbalize visual information with the need to keep text concise. So this is always a challenge, right? Of like, how much is too much information? A lot of times we're using images for presentations, for instance, when we don't really need to. It's not really adding anything to the presentation. And when you have to describe everything, it ends up taking a lot more time to be like, oh, I'm randomly sharing this image of a brain because we're talking about a brainstorm. You don't need to really have that there. So, you know, be aware of kind of that balance of like, somebody's going to have to describe everything. So I don't necessarily want to have as much text. We want to be using text that's high contrast and in a large, legible sans serif font. And we want to avoid italics and specialty or decorative fonts. And you can use an online color contrast checker. So I will, again, be linking to that at the end so you can check that out. Always offering choices is really an accessible option. So offer different ways to access the event. So if it is like a virtual event, you could do Zoom and the call-in feature. If it's in person, it'd be awesome if you could also offer a hybrid option so people could join remotely. And then provide a way for guests to request resources like the slide deck in advance. So maybe somebody who has low vision wants to have the PowerPoint in advance, so that way they can enlarge the text and be following along while you're presenting. So, you know, oftentimes that's tricky as a presenter to have everything ready, but it's really helpful to be able to provide that if you can for folks. And Bill encouraged me to add this slide as well about Zoom accessibility, which I really appreciated. So a couple of things about Zoom accessibility to be aware of. If you have a really active chat, chats can be accessible in Zoom for people who use screen readers, but it can be really hard to keep up with that, plus the information that's being presented. And so if there's a really active chat, you could say, hey, we're going to take a beat and we're going to open this up for dialogue. That could be a way to manage it. You could save the chat and share it with attendees later, so everybody could, read it then to like find out what they've missed. There'd be a couple different options, but keep in mind if that chat is like blowing up, to maybe take a beat and just let people talk for a minute. I clearly didn't finish adding to the slide, but remember, if multiple folks are speaking, make sure that you are identifying yourself. Reactions in Zoom or in Teams may not be accessible, especially when there's a lot happening. So describe if relevant. So you could say like, everyone's sharing the laughing reaction right now because that was a really funny joke. Or, Christina, I love that heart reaction. So that way you're kind of making it more accessible in a really casual way too. If everybody in the group is responding to something that's visual, explain what's happening. So you could say, oh my God, Christina's dog just jumped on the screen, and describe it for people. I think back to COVID and how many people's cats I saw walk across the screen. If everybody's stopping and reacting to that, that can be really inaccessible if you can't see what's happening. And then if you are doing a highly visual presentation, provide audio description. So, my brother, who's an artist, we had a, virtual tour of his paintings. Maybe we would hire an audio describer who could then describe them in depth, because it would be really relevant for people to really get the full experience that way. We've talked a lot about audio description, but I haven't defined it yet. So audio description, I'm sharing the image, the symbol for it again, which is AD with that TV screen with the 3 parentheses kind of representing sound coming out of it. So audio description provides additional narration that describes key visual components and unspoken action of a piece of visual media or live performance. And if it's done during a live event, it's usually provided during pauses and silences. And if it's a theatrical performance, for instance, it could be pre-show. So it could be provided at the beginning, for example, kind of like, overall, this is a black and white set, or, this is set in the 1920s. So everyone's wearing flapper costumes, or, different information like that. So people can really experience it in the moment, because it can be really challenging for an audio describer to just find those silences to be able to peek in and say, like, she grabbed the gun, information that's really important for people to understand the story, but might not be a lot of time to do it. So for live events, this narration is usually done using assistive listening devices. We talked about that in the last session I provided. So we're using that same equipment for a different audience. Usually they're using a headset that just has one earpiece. So they're able to hear the dialogue with one ear, and then they're able to hear the audio description in the other. The audio describer, if it's a live event, is usually in the sound booth, or if you don't have a sound booth of the theater, could be in the back of the audience, and they can use something called a stenographer mask that can help to muffle their voices. The costs of audio description are somewhere between $250 to $300 for like a 2-hour performance. And usually there's a cost for prep work in advance too, because the audio describer has to see the show in advance to be able to know what to say. So that's something to keep in mind for providing this. It isn't cheap, but at the same time, it can be really valuable for this audience, like Bill was describing. And Bill also encouraged me to add this slide as well, or rather this point as well, which I think was a really good one, which is audio description is most effective when the audio describer is partnered with a blind person. So somebody that can respond to that audio description in advance to be like, hey, I feel like I'm really missing out on X, Y, or Z, or can you describe this better? I don't know what this term is. That can be really, really helpful feedback for that audio describer, and also could be an opportunity for you to help support somebody who's blind or low vision, because you'd be compensating them for their time. This is another link about what audio description is from a UK organization that I'll share for you all to watch, which can be really helpful for you to kind of get the gist of what that's like for different events. And it shows us a little information about what that looks like. So that will be shared with you all as well. So another component to audio description for theater is something called touch tours. And I think touch tours is kind of a misnomer because it can be much more than touch, but that's typically what they're called. So that's where theaters are providing access to the set, props, and costumes before a performance to really firm up the descriptive information. So this is usually led by a staff member who describes a lot of the visual artistic choices, and guests can explore the space, handle some of the props or costumes if possible, or some of the furniture, and really get to understand, the whole experience before they sit down and watch the show. Often this can be, a really cheap way that you can provide access for people because typically you don't need to have other you don't have other costs other than the fact that you're there providing that information for people. I've seen theaters also include actors and artistic staff. So really having sort of this awesome bonus conversation with the actors and, the director, for instance, to discuss a lot of the visual choices that they made. So, the actors can really describe themselves to be like, I chose to grow out a beard because this character was a hermit, or, something like that. So really making it clear to the audience, a lot of the things that they might be missing if you weren't able to see it, and often can really enrich the experience for everyone. As a sighted person, I love doing these touch tours because I learned a lot of information that I wouldn't have necessarily thought about or been aware of, because as we know, and as cultural administrators, there's a lot of intention, a lot of choices that are made that if you're not privy to them, you might not even, you might take for granted. Bill encouraged me to add this slide as well about good lighting. So really making sure that, especially in your theaters, but in all of your spaces, you're being really cognizant of your lighting and really of wayfinding of people getting through the space. So some points here are, stairs or changes in elevation really need bright reflective tape. Be aware of tripping hazards. And consider, having more lighting offered when guests are seating themselves. Sometimes I think, especially for theatrical performances, we want to set the mood, but that can make it really hard for people to actually navigate the space. Or look into having kind of brighter low lighting available to make it easier if people have to get up during the performance, so they're not going to just fall down the stairs. Provide more clear signage about seat numbers, can make it easier for people to find their seats. That can make it a better experience for everybody. Cane detectable barriers. This is something that the ADA covers, is basically if you have protruding objects, even thinking about a water fountain, for instance, we don't want people to run into them if they can't see them. And so a cane detectable barrier, which would be no higher than 27 inches, helps make it obvious if people use a cane where something might, they might run into something. So that can really avoid a lot of potential issues for lots of people, but can make it more obvious for cane users to be accessing the space. And I think a lot about stanchions. Stanchions are really tricky for people who are blind or have low vision. So not just that one kind of at hip level, but there could be a lower one as well that could be cane detectable for people. Verbal description is like audio description in theater, but it is for a museum or visual arts context. So it would be describing visual elements of the works of art to help blind or low vision viewer visualize the work of art in their mind. This is typically done kind of on a one-on-one or a tour guide in a smaller group settings. You will probably be able to experience fewer objects because this is more time consuming, but it is a way to really help provide the visual elements as well as that story that Bill was talking about, providing that meaning behind it. So you're providing both of those things in one. It may also incorporate multisensory elements. So having, like Bill was mentioning, something that people can touch as well, or I've seen, scent tours incorporate incorporated with verbal description, or like an eating tour or different things like that. So you can pair it with lots of different elements, but it's helping to really make that work of art come alive, or that object come alive. We want to make sure that our staff is comfortable welcoming people who are blind or low vision. There's a lot of really awesome, like 2-minute YouTube videos you can find that's can help kind of teach everyone the basics about how to be a sighted guide. It is pretty easy once you take a beat and watch the video and think about it for a second. But we want to make sure everybody, you know, from our security guards to anyone that could possibly interact with guests, knows how to do that. And so if you're representing your organization, make sure when you're greeting that person, you're like, hey, I'm Christina, I work here at the museum. So that way, you know, you're not just some random person walking up to somebody, but you actually are there in an official capacity. If you're going to be walking away from a blind person, just let them know as well, so they're not talking to no one. If you ended up having to duck out, that's fine if you have to leave, but just say, I'm going to step away, I'll be right back, and let them know. This seems obvious, but a lot of blind people have this experience where people just grab them and try to help them, you know, very good intentions, but can be pretty freaking terrifying. So always ask if somebody needs assistance. If you see someone has a cane, you could come up and say, hey, I'm Christine, I work at the museum. Do you need anything? Or could I guide you anywhere? And if they say no, then say no, you know, let them do their thing, let them be independent. And if they say yes, you've done your sighted guide training, so you'd be able to help them. So don't touch anyone without their permission. Don't make assumptions about what people need. So scheduling versus by request. This is something that comes up for like any access service we're providing, but especially for you smaller organizations thinking about, you know, do we want to just pay for audio description and we don't know if anyone's going to use it, versus do we wait for someone to ask for it? So my suggestion, you know, all this depends on you and what's possible, but I think for larger events, for your bigger events, or for a, you know, long running event, consider proactively planning a scheduled audio description or a scheduled verbal description tour. So just, you know, we have this exhibit running for 4 months, so we're going to plan to do one verbal description tour on this date. And then you could partner with the blind service organization in your community to make sure some people could actually show up and take advantage of that, for instance. But I would be proactive in doing that. That goes a long way to really addressing that belonging piece that Bill was mentioning. Consider incorporating verbal description techniques in all tours to really strengthen the experience and prepare the tour guides. So doing verbal description, I've done a lot of training for that when I worked in an art museum, and that helped me be a better tour guide for everybody, and helped me be prepared for, you know, oh, we have some guests here. We have some older guests here, for instance, that end up, you know, being low vision. Like, I can already be providing that, and I'm not thrown by the fact that they're there. And it can be a great, you know, opportunity for you to work with docents, for instance, or your volunteers. You want to, you know, keep in mind that guests can request an access service for any event. It is their legal right. And wherever you're possible, you need to provide it for them. So that's where I think it's helpful to be proactive by scheduling it for your bigger events that you are really, you know, putting a lot of money behind. So that way people, you know, can plan on it rather than you kind of reacting and being surprised when somebody asks for it. And, you know, this all costs money. I recognize that. And so, you know, being able to incorporate this into a grant request. So if you have this big performance that you're planning on, make sure that you're adding a line item for audio description and for promotion of audio description and all of those different pieces. That should be included in nearly every grant you're doing. There should be an access line item that's included in that. So be budgeting for that. Access doesn't need to be a separate thing. It should be a part of whatever event or performance or exhibit or whatever you're putting on. We've talked a lot about a statement of welcome, and this is where you're basically including this in every event or, you know, e-blast that you're providing, which is making it really easy for people to request things or to learn about access services that are being put on. So trying to say, you are welcome here. We're not just doing this because we have to, but we want this to be for you. And we're providing, for instance, audio description for this event. If you need another service, email or call this number with as much advance notice as you can. Having both an email and phone number is really helpful, especially for this audience. I think might be helpful to have a phone number so people could call if they want to take it offline. That might be more helpful, especially I think for older audience members who are blind or have low vision, but for anybody might be helpful, and ensure that this is being checked by somebody on a regular basis. And we want this to be informational, but we want to also have this be welcoming. So definitely make sure that it is not just a compliance thing, but this is a belonging thing too. I'm doing a lot of talking today, but I'm almost done. The last thing I wanted to talk about is this really fascinating concept about access fatigue. And I'll share an article with Abby that she'll share with you all. And this was coined by Professor Annika Conrad. And access fatigue is the fatigue that comes from constantly having to explain one's accessibility needs, disability, and having to ask for help to meet one's needs. So Dr. Conrad did her dissertation on this topic, specifically about people who are blind or have low vision, but I think this idea applies to every space, really. But it's about sort of all the work and the labor that goes into being disabled. There's all this extra work we've talked about in general about planning and about being prepared to be disappointed, all of those different pieces. And then on top of that, you're often having to explain to somebody what you need in order to participate in an event. And that can be really taxing, so much so that people might opt to not identify at all, to not ask in advance, because it's just too much work and they're just tired. And that is where I think it's especially important for us to try to make this as easy as possible for people to request things that they need, or we're automatically providing it and scheduling it and communicating it, to make it really as straightforward as possible. We want it to be seamless for everybody, and that would include people who are blind or have low vision. So really be thinking about how can we remove barriers to reduce access fatigue for our guests with disabilities. And for our context today, especially for people who are blind or have low vision. A bunch of resources that we're sharing here as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's any quick questions before we turn this over to Abby to be done. It doesn't look like there's any questions in the chat right now. Is there any one question that somebody has that we could cover before we end?
Christina, as always, a wealth of information. And I think probably there's not a lot of questions because you've covered so much, and I'm sure people are digesting everything that you've just shared. So thank you so much for presenting for not only this session, but for the whole series. We really appreciate the time and thoroughness that you've taken with this. As Christina mentioned, we will be sharing her slides with all of you. So all of the resources that she mentioned and the links will be available. And all three of these videos will be up on the Donnelly Foundation's YouTube channel. And we will be sending out that link to all of the people that attended today as well. I can't thank you all enough for leaning into these accessibility conversations. The Donnelly Foundation, as always, is in partnership with all of you, and we are learning along with you. I just want to say again, thank you to Christina and to our guest today, Bill Green, for sharing. I also want to thank SignNexus and Bonnie, our live captioner today. As I mentioned earlier, Victor Cole has been on this call, and he will be doing audio descriptions for the recording of this session. And so thank you to Victor. And I also just want to say thank you to Kyle Hammond of KBH Media, who has been our tech savvy engineer, incorporating all of these initiatives and working with our service providers to bring all of you these sessions seamlessly. So thank you to everyone involved. I see a lot of thank yous to Christina in the chat happening as well. And yes, Kyle says we are all learning. So absolutely. And thank you. We'll be in touch with this recording and the information that Christina provided in her presentation. Thank you all. Have a great day.